mental health, emotional health, physical health, deeper understanding, actionable takeaways to improve your quality of life. We're the Level Up Guys.
Even guys can have emotionally literate conversations about these hard topics, and we're the guys that are going to prove it. Let's level up.
We are the Level Up Guys. I'm here with my best friend, Jarrett. He's a health professional, mental health, emotional health, all of the health. I'm a yoga teacher, personal trainer. I do personal training in group environments. This is our podcast. Our episode here is about courage 101. It took us a lot of courage to be able to start this podcast, to tell you that, because we all seem to have built-in excuses for doing all this stuff. So Jarrett and I mean, this is really like revisiting a lot of previous conversations that we've had, especially during quarantine. This is when we really started to connect. We've been best friends for a long time. Took a lot of courage to be able to get started doing this podcast thing. So starting off right off the bat, Jarrett, like, what's the brain? I've heard a lot about like the amygdala and the lizard brain and like this resistance that we have. And oftentimes, even the littlest things, like if you're going to speak in front of the PTA, or you have to say something, I train Pilates teachers and yoga teachers, and public speaking is a big deal. Why does it feel like when we're public speaking or doing something like that, it feels like you're like sitting next to a tiger that's about to rip your face off? What's up?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, I think the easiest answer is that your amygdala doesn't know the difference. It can't tell. All that it knows is there's a threat enough to raise my stress hormones to a certain amount, and it might as well be a hungry tiger, or it might as well be just something that feels hard or feels unfamiliar, or like there could be perspective of you of being a certain way that you don't want to be seen as, or revealed or found out. So I mean, it all comes down to vulnerability, I think. Vulnerability is at the heart of sitting next to a tiger, right? Because our physical safety, like, we are putting ourselves in a very precarious position, but also social vulnerability and emotional vulnerability. Brain doesn't know the difference when it's coming from the amygdala.
So, I mean, that's so interesting. Like, we do know the difference, like in our conscious brain, thinking in the moment, you're sitting at the PTA and there is no tiger. Is this like, it seems like it might be an evolutionary thing that really is good for us, that protects us so that we're aware. But like, I'm from Boston and I used to go to Fenway Park. And if you're sitting on the third baseline, you better be paying attention, because you might get hit by a broken bat. So like, that's where it comes into, like, it's a benefit for us to be like aware and hyper alert. But how do we regulate that so we don't have, because it's hard when you feel that, it's hard to be courageous when you feel kind of in a pressure, or, like, oh my goodness, I might die, when you're not going to die.
Yeah, well, let me first say that even though there are situations where our amygdala is overreacting, it's actually a really important function, right? Like the fear response is a really important function, because there are going to be situations that people come across, God forbid, that you need to have an immediate built-in reaction. And we have typically one of three, or a couple of three sometimes, fight, flight, and freeze, that will literally save your life. And so I want to start off by saying the fear response it's not like a good or bad thing, right? But I think you're pointing out, how do you tell the difference? How do you regulate it? And the part of the brain that you were mentioning is aware that, okay, I'm not sitting next to a tiger. It's the prefrontal cortex in the front, and that's where kind of all of our most evolved thinking and language comes from. Our thoughts are in the form of language, but unfortunately, when the amygdala gets activated, it shuts that down, and it really is prioritizing the survival response at that point. So those thoughts don't even come in. So if you want to tap into how can I change that, you got to do it through the body and through the nervous system, which is more directly connected to the amygdala and the systems that go with that.
Super resonates with me. I mean, connecting to the body. So in yoga class, the style of yoga that I teach, we really conscientiously breathe through our nose throughout the entire time, because we would be affecting a certain part of our nervous system, right? The parasympathetic nervous system. Yeah. So we never feel that overwhelmed fight or flight thing. However, in Pilates class that I teach, it's high intensity interval training. So we're moving a little bit faster, right? It's in the heat and we breathe through our mouth. So we do have a little bit of fight or flight or freeze. And the
Yeah.
goal is to be able to have it in your brain and through the proper environment. Like, you don't have to run, you don't have to flight, you don't have to freeze. We can fight through this.
Yeah.
Really healthy. What are we trying to do? We're trying to get like better our lives. We're trying to level up our health, level up our wellness. Like, if there is that, yeah, we can fight, because it's not easy. I mean, everybody wants to be healthy. Everybody wants to be emotionally well, physically well. Like, the question is never, what do you want? Is, what are you willing to do for it? Like, are you willing to be courageous? Right?
Yeah.
Recognize, and you can only improve it. Like, if you recognize that there's actually part of our brain, the lizard brain, the amygdala, that's it's an evolutionary thing. We have to recognize that we're not going to get eaten by a tiger. We can, lace up our sneakers real tight, start a podcast, call it the Level Up Guys, and let's go and be courageous. So you started talking a little bit about vulnerability, and that, this is episode 1. I'm sure we're going to have an entire episode in the future about vulnerability, maybe a bunch of them, like a big part of the whole entire thing. Vulnerability, part of it is, you have to be willing to maybe fail. Like, it might not work. That's such a speed bump for, like, what if it doesn't work? What if it's not right? What if people judge me or critique me? Like, that's a big limiting factor in even getting started.
Yeah, you're talking about risk taking, right? So, and when you take a risk, and that could be something as simple as doing something differently than how you've always done it, or doing something differently than what feels easy in your body, right? Like, it might cause some discomfort in some way, but doing it differently, that is taking a risk. And here's the thing with risk, right? It can fail, but it also can change your life, right? In really positive ways. And so I think that's where people get stuck, right? I would rather choose something that doesn't change anything and stays familiar, and continue to experience failing in a certain way, but in a predictable way, rather than put my hopes into something and take a risk and maybe have the most beautiful life as a result of it, or feel incredibly proud of myself, or gain new confidence and self-esteem, or, all kinds of things, right? Build a new skill, or any of these things. But ultimately, on the other side of that is, what if, right? What if I don't? Now I have to face some sadness, which I think is kind of on the spectrum of emotions when we fail. But that's a hard one to sit with for a lot of people. And yeah, I'm sure we'll get more into emotions as well in other episodes. But courage is a big part of one, and courage to sit with hard emotions is a huge part of my leveling up. So yeah.
Yeah. 2 of my favorite book authors, Seth Godin and Stephen Pressfield, talk a lot about these topics, and I love it. And Stephen Pressfield wrote a great book, I'm sure everybody's heard of it, on the War of Art. And he calls that feeling of hesitation to create our art or to do our thing, the resistance. And that's in that book by Stephen Pressfield. And then Seth Godin, who's a great writer.
Wait, can I actually hold you there? Because there's something I think relevant with that. So I love that moment of pause, that resistance, right? That's actually really important for courage, because if we have, in order for courage to exist, we have to be afraid first. It is a response to fear. It's not in place of fear, right? And so,
wait, say that again. That was great.
So courage is not in place of fear. It's a response to fear. So for courage to exist, fear has to exist first, right? And fear is going to it's going to cue up fight, flight, freeze, right? The stress response. And for that moment, right? For that moment that it does, if we can recognize that, oh, I'm in the stress response. And sometimes you can do that through, like, my body, my breathing speeding up, my heart rate, like I'm feeling really warm, like, butterflies in my stomach, whatever it is. So ultimately, that moment of pause where the resistance is showing up, that is the cue for courage, right? Like, the cue comes when I feel resistance, because now I know that I'm afraid, right? If you, like, just to kind of use a silly example, there were a knight slaying a dragon, right? If he's kind of, totally not feeling afraid at all, right? And running in there, sword waving and, with his shield, like that dragon's going to set him on fire, right? Or bite his head off, right? Like, so the fear and then courage response, it actually gives us an opportunity to think. And if we can use it, it gives us an opportunity to think, all right, how am I going to approach this thing that I'm afraid of? And maybe I'm afraid of it for good reason. Let's not just, kind of ignorantly ignore and run in, right?
Yeah, don't do it. It's a fucking dragon. You're never going to win. I mean, think it through. Just back up. You need like 6 guys at least.
Yeah, get some more guys, get some more equipment,
What are you doing fighting dragons? I mean, I've watched Game of Thrones. You just don't do that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, some people do, but, it doesn't usually end well unless you get another dragon.
Yeah.
That's another episode, though.
You laid out my point beautifully. What I was going to say, like stealing from Seth Godin, fear is the compass.
I love that.
Fear is a compass. Like, and oh man, I'm not really sure. Like, let's go. You have to dive into it like that.
Right. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. Blah, blah. Let's go. You.
Yeah. First episode, talking over each other. No. So I'm sure that'll happen again. We both get really excited about this stuff. Okay. You're going to make me lose my train of thought too. First episode, but I'm going to have the courage to keep going.
I think there's a big difference because I'm a chronic interrupter. But I think there's a big difference between interrupting someone and being so passionate about what you're saying that you both can't wait. Like, I love that part when you both can't wait to say something. Like, I think that's great.
Yeah. And we can finish each other's
sentences.
So there you go.
Yeah. We've known each other a long time. Like,
I thought you were going to say sandwiches.
We'll finish each other. I mean, I've been around you. You eat like a champion. So I don't think I'd even get a bite.
No, I'll share if you ask though.
When I took over the studio in 2015, like I owned a yoga studio in North Carolina, Pilates studio. 2015, I took it over. It was open before me, and I was living in Boston. Jarrett lives there now. And I had my whole thing going and all my friends and everything working. I was a traveling yoga teacher for a long time and found this place. And I was like, all right, if I'm going to have a career in doing what I'm going to do, helping people in yoga and fitness and health and wellness, it's not really sustainable to be a teacher if you want to have a good quality of life. So I'm like, I'm going to start a business and have this thing. Had a little bit of previous business experience. So I bought the studio and I packed up all of my stuff in my Jeep with my dog, and I put my motorcycle on a little trailer, and I drove down South 95. Took me 13 hours, and I arrived in Wilmington, and I didn't know anybody in town. I walked in and was like, hey, my name is Billy, and like, here we go. And I had spent all my resources on buying the studio in the first place, and Jared knows I've told this story a lot.
I remember actually you packing up and I remember. I think I was there when you were going to maybe take off very shortly.
Yeah, I had a ridiculous open air trailer because it was last minute. I didn't know it was like this
motorcycle strapped down
to this big giant blue tarp, like flapping in the breeze as I'm driving down. That was wild.
So you get there, you don't know anybody. I
don't know anybody, and I don't have any resources. So I got an air mattress and I set it up in one of the secret back rooms, and I slept in the back for a year.
Of the studio,
back of the studio for a year. Because I wanted to like pay the lease and do all that stuff. And at the time, I didn't think anything about it because I was like, this is really what I want to do. And I'm super excited. And, if it fails, like I can just come back and just keep doing what I'm doing. So I didn't feel that like stress and anxiety. But then looking back on it, and whenever I tell the story, people are like, oh, that's really courageous. And that was really brave. Mm-hmm. And I'm looking back, I'm like, yeah, that was, I kind of feel proud of myself for paying my dues a little bit to be able to, put yourself in a good position. So it's interesting how you can go through those challenges, and maybe only in perspective, you'd be like, man, that was a really scary thing that I did. And I'm super proud of myself for kind of pulling that off, But if you're riding the wave, and if you're like kind of going with it and yeah, it was scary. It's still scary. I wake up every morning and I'm thinking, my whole life depends on like running this business and keeping it going and doing all the stuff and right.
Yeah. Makes sense. So do you feel like kind of reasoned with your fear, or maybe it wasn't fear. Maybe you had some like nervousness, but also had business experience before. You had maybe some amount of a plan or something. So maybe that helped it not be such a stress response.
Yeah.
But I don't know what, like, because you're kind of saying like, you don't remember really feeling afraid, right? But people are then labeling it for you as courageous.
Right. Yeah. Maybe because it was a skill set that I was already like adept in, and I had put in a lot of hours already doing it. So I felt really confident. Whereas if I was going to start a new endeavor, like if you and I said, hey, let's start a podcast, like then is it different now? I'm like, okay, I'm new at this. Like I haven't practiced this for as long, Hey, let's move to Wichita and we're going to buy a podcast studio, Jarrett. And we're going to start this like, well, all right, let's go. I'm scared to death. And, but like, I don't know, for me, I like that as a motivator. I like that as like the fear of failing. I think it was like a big time motivator for me.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. So for me, I think the fear of failing probably, like for you, as you said, it motivates you. It kind of creates that fight response so you get through it. I think in my experience of it, it more shuts me down a bit. And I end up experiencing less motivation to then go accomplish the thing. And that's just because our nervous systems are wired differently, right? And there are going to be some situations that you might jump into and full force, and you're there because your nervous system led you there. And it's like, oh, maybe this was a good shutdown one, or maybe this was one to avoid. And for me, right, it's going to be more of like, oh, like, Jarrett, let's get you, what can we do to kind of energize you rather than decrease your energy?
Right.
And yeah, I mean, that's been one of the big barriers for me, for things that, I'm afraid of, or that I have to use courage for. It's that my nervous system loses energy in those endeavors. And that makes it really hard to accomplish them. But it sounds like it energizes you in some ways.
Well, yeah, I mean, sometimes maybe that's the fairy tale that I'm creating in my mind. Like if we're talking about like being courageous, and a limit to being courageous might be stress. And if stress is kind of like fear of what might come, how much of our inhibition to fully be invested in super courageous is the fairy tale of what we make of what might happen later on? Because we have no idea what might happen later on, because the failure, when I first got my driver's license, I was like a weekend to have my driver's license. Remember the freedom of like when you first get your driver's license?
Oh yeah. For me, it was a little bit later in life, but yes, I do remember. Yeah.
We should do an episode on gratitude, because I think gratitude, that word has been like hijacked by a lot of people. And it's like this hokey word, but like the fundamental aspect of happiness is like, remember what it felt like to have a car and you were like, oh my God, I can go to my friend's house and whenever I want. I can go, like, that we take it for granted, but like, oh my goodness, the freedom to do that. Anyhow,
we should definitely do a gratitude episode. It's when you can be courageous with things that I think go inside it, things that we have previously felt shame for or shame about. Actually, I think gratitude is what ends up replacing shame for those things when we tackle them with courage. Yeah. Sign me up for that episode too. Yeah. And make sure you guys, if you're liking what you got, like follow us, subscribe to us. We're starting a YouTube page. We're doing all of the stuff that typical people do who want to succeed. We're going to try our best, when we want to have your support along the way. So yeah, wherever this is, post it, comment, share it, do whatever it takes.
That's it for today, you guys. Make sure to follow us. You can find us on all the major platforms. If you really like what you heard, maybe share it with a friend, share it with a buddy, maybe share it with an enemy, because we all need a little bit of love. We're going to level up together. See you next time.